don't care what it is, get this unauthorized vehicle out of here right now or face the consequences.
We need a bigger truck.
This story sounds unbelievable at first, but the more you hear it, the more it starts to make perfect sense in the strangest way possible. Imagine waking up one morning and walking outside with your coffee and seeing a tow truck trying to haul away something that absolutely cannot and should not ever be towed. Not a car, not a trailer, not even a boat, but a full-size combine harvester sitting peacefully on your own land. And the wildest part, the person who called the tow truck wasn't confused, wasn't mistaken, and definitely wasn't joking. She was dead serious. This was one of those classic situations where someone with a little bit of authority decided they had unlimited power. And honestly, stories like this happen way more often than people realize. Now, what makes this situation even crazier is the confidence behind it. Because this wasn't just some random complaint. This was an HOA Karen, the kind who walks around with printed bylaws, a clipboard, and the absolute belief that she controls everything within a 5-mile radius. You know the kind of person who measures grass height with a ruler and sends violation notices over the color of a mailbox. And somehow, in her mind, she believed she could enforce HOA rules on property that wasn't even part of the HOA. Yeah, let that sink in. Bro, hearing this part alone just blew my mind. Because it's one thing to complain, it's another thing entirely to call a towing company and try to remove heavy agricultural equipment from land you don't own, based on rules that don't even apply. And that's not just confidence, that's next level entitlement. And the craziest twist, the tow company actually showed up, which means at some point, someone thought this request sounded legit. But here's where things take a turn. Because unlike most HOA horror stories where things drag out forever, this one had a moment, one very specific moment, where reality hit hard. The tow driver took one look around, asked a few questions, checked something very important, and suddenly everything shifted. The energy changed, the power dynamic flipped, and what happened next was one of the most satisfying reality checks you'll ever hear. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud, aggressive, or dramatic. Sometimes it's just letting the truth exist long enough for the right person to notice it. And when that happens, people who thought they were in control suddenly realized they were never in charge to begin with. 3, the property sat in a strange kind of in-between space, the kind that didn't fully belong to suburbia, but wasn't quite farmland either. It was one of those edge zone areas where new housing developments had slowly crept outward, stopping just short of older agricultural land that had existed long before anyone thought about building identical houses with matching fences. On one side, there were neatly trimmed lawns, paved sidewalks, and identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. On the other side, there were open fields, gravel driveways, and equipment that clearly had a purpose far beyond aesthetics. The homeowner had been there long before the HOA ever existed. The land wasn't in part of any managed community, wasn't subject to any association rules, and certainly wasn't obligated to follow the aesthetic preferences of people who had moved in years later. And the property had history, it had purpose, and most importantly, it had clearly defined legal boundaries that separated it from the neighboring developments. But as often happens, those boundaries existed on paper and in law, while certain people chose to ignore them entirely. The HOA itself was relatively new, created when the development expanded and more homes were built. At first, it was just about maintaining shared spaces, organizing small neighborhood rules, and keeping things visually consistent. But over time, the leadership changed, and with that change came a shift in attitude. The HOA president was the kind of person who didn't just enforce rules, she lived for them. Every detail mattered, every regulation was important, and more than anything, she believed that her authority extended further than it actually did. In her mind, anything that affected the view of the neighborhood was automatically within her jurisdiction. And that's where the problem began. Because from certain angles within the HOA community, you could see the edge of the neighboring property, and on that property sat a massive combine harvester. It wasn't new, it wasn't shiny, but it was functional, well-maintained, and clearly being used for its intended purpose. To anyone reasonable, it was just farm equipment sitting on private land. But to the HOA president, it was something else entirely. It was an eyesore. It didn't match the aesthetic of the community. It didn't fit the image she wanted to present. And most importantly, it existed in a space she could see but couldn't control. And that lack of control didn't sit well with her. At first, the approach was indirect. Notices were sent, though not officially enforceable. Suggestions were made, phrased as if compliance was expected. There were polite but persistent attempts to encourage the homeowner to move or conceal the equipment. Each time, the response was simple, calm, and consistent. The property was not part of the HOA, the rules did not apply, and the equipment was staying exactly where it was. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A clear boundary had been established, a legal distinction had been explained, but not everyone accepts limits easily, especially those who are used to being obeyed. Instead of stepping back, the HOA president leaned in further. She started documenting the situation, taking photos, making notes, and building what she likely believed was a case. She spoke to neighbors, framing the issue as something that affected the entire community. She created a narrative where the presence of the harvester wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. And slowly, that narrative began to feel real to her, because when someone repeats something enough times, especially within a small circle of agreement, it starts to feel like truth, even when it isn't. And that's when the decision was made. 5. Not to negotiate, not to escalate through legal channels, but to take action. The shift from annoyance to action didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it felt sudden, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside the HOA president's mindset. What had once been passive complaints and indirect pressure slowly transformed into something far more deliberate. She stopped hinting and started planning, and the more she thought about it, the more justified she felt. In her version of reality, she wasn't Tido overstepping, she was correcting a problem that no one else had the courage to address. And that's exactly how situations like this spiral, because when someone convinces themselves they're in the right, logic becomes optional. She began escalating quietly at first. More photos were taken, this time from different angles, carefully framed to make the harvester appear closer to HOA homes than it actually was. Emails were sent to residents, subtly framing the situation as a shared issue. The wording was clever, never outright false, but definitely misleading. Phrases like impacting neighborhood, aesthetics, and potential violation concerns started circulating, even though the property in question wasn't legally tied to the HOA in any way. Bro, hearing this part honestly made me shake my head, because this is exactly how people build false authority, by repeating something until it sounds official. And slowly, a few neighbors started nodding along, not because they fully understood the situation, but because it sounded structured, organized, and confident. And confidence, even when misplaced, can be surprisingly persuasive, but not everyone bought into it. Some residents questioned things quietly, pointing out that the land clearly wasn't NT part of the HOA boundary. Others simply didn't care enough to get involved. And a few, probably the most aware, recognized exactly what was happening and chose to stay out of it entirely. 6, because they knew where this was heading. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained consistent. No reactions, no arguments, no escalation, just quiet confidence backed by legal clarity. The harvester stayed exactly where it had always been, unmoved and unaffected by the growing tension around it, and that calm response, it only made things worse. Because for someone seeking control, indifference feels like defiance. That's when the HOA president made her move. Instead of consulting legal counsel or verifying jurisdiction, steps that would have immediately clarified the situation, she chose a different path, a faster one, a more direct one. The kind of decision that feels powerful in the moment, but rarely holds up under scrutiny. She called a towing company, and not just casually. She presented the situation with full confidence, framing it as an unauthorized vehicle parked in violation of community rules, and she spoke with authority, using the language of enforcement, implying ownership over the situation that didn't actually exist. And from the towing company's perspective, it sounded routine. Requests like this weren't uncommon. OAAAs often coordinated vehicle removals within their own communities, so they scheduled it, And just like that, a simple misunderstanding, no, not even a misunderstanding, a deliberate overreach was set in motion. The day the tow truck arrived, the atmosphere shifted immediately. It wasn't subtle. A large vehicle pulling into a quiet edge of neighborhood space tends to draw attention. Neighbors noticed, curtains moved, phones came out, that quiet tension that had been building behind emails, and conversations suddenly became visible, real, and impossible to ignore. The HOA president was already there, waiting. That alone said everything. Because this wasn't a reaction, this was an expectation. She believed this was going to work. And for a brief moment, it looked like it might. 7. The tow truck positioned itself carefully, the driver stepping out to assess the situation. From a distance, it probably seemed straightforward, a large piece of equipment sitting near a residential boundary. But as he got closer, details started to emerge, details that didn't quite match the story he'd been told. And the size of the machine, the condition of the lab, the placement, and most importantly, the markers, small, simple, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, but impossible to ignore once you saw them. Property boundary indicators. And that's the moment everything began to shift, because up until now, this situation had been built on assumptions, but assumptions don't hold much weight when faced with something concrete. The driver paused, looked again, then started asking questions, and just like that, the entire narrative began to unravel. The moment the tow truck driver stopped and really looked around, everything changed. Up until that point, the situation had been driven entirely by one person's confidence, one person's version of reality, and one person's assumption that authority didn't need verification. But now there was a third party involved, someone whose job wasn't to argue, wasn't to assume, but to confirm. And that's where things started falling apart. The driver didn't rush, he didn't act impulsively. Instead, he stepped back slightly, scanning the ground, the layout at the edges of the property. His eyes moved from the massive combine harvester to the surrounding area, then toward the subtle but unmistakable boundary markers that defined exactly where one property ended and another began. Those small details carried more weight than any argument ever could. Bro, this is the kind of moment that gives you instant second-hand satisfaction, because you can already feel what's coming. 8. The HOA president continued pushing, her tone still firm, still convinced, still operating under the belief that this was just a minor delay before compliance. But the driver's hesitation spoke louder than anything she could say, because hesitation in situations like this means doubt. And doubt means things aren't adding up. He asked a few simple questions, not aggressive, not confrontational, just factual. Questions about ownership, about authorization, about who exactly had the legal right to request the removal. And those questions, as basic as they were, hit like pressure against a weak structure, because there were no solid answers, only assumptions, only insistence, only confidence without proof. And the homeowner, who had been quietly observing the entire situation, didn't need to argue, didn't need to interrupt. The truth was already doing the work, and sometimes that's the most powerful position to be in, when you don't have to defend anything because reality is already on your side. The driver then did something that completely shifted the power dynamic. He refused, not dramatically, not loudly, just firmly and professionally. He explained that without clear authorization from the property owner or legal documentation proving jurisdiction, he couldn't proceed. The equipment wasn't abandoned, it wasn't illegally parked, and most importantly, it wasn't on HOA-controlled land. And just like that, the entire situation collapsed. Because everything the HOA president had built her argument on disappeared in a single grounded decision. There was no escalation left, no authority left to lean on, no control left to exercise, just silence, and the slow realization that this had gone too far. But here's where it gets even better. So, because moments like this don't just end, they echo. 9 neighbors were watching, some from a distance, some more openly now that things had clearly shifted. And what they saw wasn't just a disagreement. They saw a boundary being enforced, not by emotion, not by argument, but by simple, undeniable fact. And that kind of clarity, it changes everything. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The kind of silence that settles in after something very public doesn't go the way someone expected. The tow truck remained idle for a moment longer. Its presence now awkward rather than authoritative. The driver, having already made his position clear, didn't linger. There was no reason to. The situation had resolved itself. The moment facts replaced assumptions. Within minutes, the truck pulled away, leaving behind nothing but dust and a completely shifted atmosphere. For the HOA president, this wasn't just a failed attempt, it was a visible loss of control. And the thing about control is that once it cracks, people notice. Neighbors who had previously stayed neutral were now seeing the situation differently. What once looked like confident leadership now appeared as overreach. What once sounded official now felt questionable. Because when authority is tested and fails publicly, it forces people to reassess everything that came before it. Bro, this is exactly how reputations start to flip. The homeowner, on the other hand, didn't celebrate, didn't escalate, didn't even react in a way that drew attention. And that quiet response made an even stronger statement than any argument ever could. Because it showed something important. This was never about winning. It was about standing on solid ground and letting the truth speak when it mattered. But the aftermath didn't stop there. 10. Within the HOA itself, conversations started shifting. Questions began surfacing. Quiet at first, but persistent. Some residents wanted clarification about boundaries. Others started reviewing the actual scope of HOA authority. And a few began wondering how many other rules had been enforced without proper basis. Because once doubt enters a system built on assumption, it spreads quickly. The HOA president attempted to regain footing, but it wasn't the same. The confidence was still there, but now it carried hesitation, because there's a difference between authority that's accepted and authority that asks questions. And once people start questioning, things change. Policies were reviewed, communication became more careful, and slowly, without any dramatic confrontation, the overreach that had once driven decisions began to shrink back into its actual limits. As for the property itself, nothing changed. The combine harvester remained exactly where it had always been. Steady, unmoved, and now symbolizing something far beyond its original purpose. It wasn't just equipment anymore. It was a reminder, a very visible, very real reminder that boundaries exist for a reason and that ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. Bro, hearing this entire situation unfold honestly says a lot more about real life than most people realize, because this wasn't just about a combine harvester or even an HOA dispute. This was about something way bigger, how easily people can confuse influence with authority, and how dangerous that confusion becomes when no one questions it early on. This is exactly how people act in real life. Someone gets used to being listened to, used to having their opinions treated like rules, and slowly, without even realizing it, they start believing that their reach is unlimited. And the wild part, most of the time, no one challenges it until it goes too far. And when it does, reality hits hard, just like it did here. 11. What really stands out in this story is how the homeowner handled everything. No shouting, no unnecessary escalation, no trying to win the situation emotionally. Just patience, clarity, and trust in the facts. That's something a lot of people underestimate, because in situations like this, reacting aggressively often makes things worse. But staying grounded, that forces the other side to either prove their position or collapse under it. And that's exactly what happened. That moment when the tow truck driver paused and started asking questions, that's the key lesson right there. Because all it takes is one neutral person, one moment of verification for everything built on assumption to fall apart. And that's incredible when you really think about it. Now, if you're living in or near an HOA, there's a real takeaway here. Always understand the exact boundaries of authority, both yours and theirs. Don't rely on what sounds official. Check what's actually enforceable. Because HOAs can only operate within very specific limits, and anything outside of that is just opinion dressed up as power. And on the flip side, if you're part of an HOA board or leadership, this is a perfect example of what not to do. Overreach doesn't just fail, it damages trust. And once trust is gone, it's really hard to get back. Honestly, that's what makes this story so satisfying. Not because someone got embarrassed, but because the truth held its ground without needing to fight. That's rare, and when it happens, it sticks. And honestly, stories like this are the reason people love these kinds of real-life situations, because they remind us that no matter how complicated things seem, the truth has a way of cutting through all the noise. That moment when everything flips, when confidence meets reality, and when someone realizes they've gone too far, that's what makes it unforgettable. But now I want to hear from you, 12. Have you ever dealt with an HOA situation that went completely out of control? Or seen someone try to enforce rules where they clearly had no authority? Drop your story down in the comments. Because, trust me, these situations happen way more often than people think, and every story adds something new to learn from. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more stories just like this, because there are plenty more unbelievable situations out there. And we're just getting started. Until next time, stay aware, know your boundaries, and don't let anyone tell you they own something they clearly don't.